The sun was falling low behind
You're safe.
the ridges when Sheriff Luke Carson
Thank you for
spotted
bringing
movement.
her home.
Out near the dry creek bed, a small figure staggering through the dust like a lost shadow. He pulled on his reins, the horse slowing as he leaned forward, squinting against the light. What he saw made him frown deeply. A little Apache girl, barefoot, her skin caked with dust, a torn deerskin dress clinging to her thin frame. She looked no older than 7, clutching something small and broken in her hand, a straw doll missing half its head. Luke climbed down slowly, making sure not to scare her, and spoke in a low voice, the way one might calm a frightened horse. She froze, eyes wide, trembling as if expecting harm. He took off his hat and knelt, holding out his canteen. She hesitated, then reached for it with shaking hands, drinking greedily. Her eyes softened for the briefest moment, and Luke saw something there, fear. Yes, but also trust trying to be born. Without another word, he wrapped his coat around her small shoulders and lifted her gently onto his horse. She didn't resist. Her head rested against his chest as he rode back toward the ranch, her breathing uneven but steady. Luke had buried his wife 3 years. Before and with her had gone his will to care for much of anything. He had sworn he'd live and die alone, the land being his only company. But as he rode under the reddening sky, the weight of that little girl against him awoke something long dormant, a stirring of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The town of Dry Creek wasn't kind to those who looked different. When Luke arrived with the girl, curious eyes followed him, whispers rising like dust from the ground. "A redskin child," someone muttered. Luke ignored them. He was used to silence and harder things than gossip. He took the girl home, cleaned her up, gave her some of his late wife's old clothes, and tried to speak gently, though she barely understood. She told him her name was Nita, her voice no louder than the crackle of a fire. Luke rode into town the next morning to ask around, but no one had heard of any Apache settlements nearby losing a child. The preacher advised him to send her east, somewhere she belongs, but Luke only shook his head. "She belongs where she's safe," he said, and left it at that. Days turned into weeks. Luke kept working the ranch, and Nita began following him everywhere, feeding the chickens, brushing the horses, laughing softly when he stumbled on his own boots. She didn't speak much, but her silence wasn't empty anymore. It was calm like the wind before rain. Sometimes she would sing to herself in Apache, her little voice rising like smoke. Luke didn't understand the words, but he liked the sound. Slowly, she became a part of the ranch, the little ghost who turned into light. One evening, as the sky turned the color of fire, Luke sat on the porch with his old dog snoring by his feet. Nita played in the yard, chasing the last rays of sun. He realized then that for the first time in years, he didn't feel the hollow ache that used to live in his chest. Somehow the silence didn't hurt anymore. But peace in the West was always temporary. It was 3 months later when trouble rode in. Not the kind with guns, but something heavier. Luke was fixing the fence when he saw them coming. 5 riders moving in slow formation, dust curling around their horses. They were Apache scouts, proud and silent, their faces set like stone. Luke's hand hovered near his revolver out of habit, but he sensed they weren't there to fight. The lead rider dismounted and spoke in broken English, his tone urgent. "Girl, Nita," he said, pointing toward the cabin. Luke called her out. When she saw them, Nita froze, her small body tensing. The scout spoke to her in Apache, voices low and rapid. Luke couldn't make sense of it, but he caught a few English words. "Mother searching. Survive." The man looked at Luke with eyes that had seen too. Much loss, and said simply, "Her mother alive." Luke stood there, his heart twisting. He had come to love the girl as his own, teaching her to ride, to laugh again, to sleep without fear. Now he was being told she had a mother, somewhere out in the canyons, waiting for the daughter she thought dead. That night, Luke sat by the fire, turning the truth over and over in his mind. He'd lost one family before. Could he bear to lose another, even if it was the right thing? He looked over at Nita sleeping by the hearth, clutching her doll, her face peaceful. He knew the answer before he could admit it. A man who took in a lost child had to do right by her, even if it broke him. At dawn he packed supplies, saddled 2 horses, and rode out with the scouts, Nita beside him. They traveled for days, through red canyons and dry valleys until they reached a hidden, Apache camp near a stream glimmering under the sun. There, standing by the water, was a woman, tall, strong, her hair long and black as night, her eyes bright with tears she had fought too long to hold. When Nita saw her, she cried out, jumping from her horse and running into her arms. The woman fell to her knees, clutching her daughter, as if she could keep her from ever being lost again. Luke watched silent, the wind tugging at his hat. The woman looked up at him then, eyes full of gratitude and pain. She spoke softly in Apache, then one word in English, "Thank you." Luke nodded, unable to speak. He turned his horse, but Nita ran back to him, grabbing his hand. "Papa," she whispered. It nearly broke him in two. "Ayana," her mother called gently, and Nita, with trembling lips, let go. Luke rode away, the echo of her voice, following him long after the valley disappeared. Behind the ridges, he had done what was right, but the right thing often came with a hollow cost. Back at his ranch, the quiet was heavier than ever. He looked out across the plains, knowing he'd never forget that child or the eyes of the woman who had looked at him not with anger but with something deeper, something he would one day understand. The nights felt longer after Luke returned to his ranch alone. The silence that once comforted him now lingered like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Every sound reminded him of Nita, the clatter of the wooden bucket at the well, the creak of the barn door, even the whistle of the wind through the cottonwoods. He tried to bury himself in work, patching fences, breaking wild horses, tending to the land like a man trying to drown his thoughts in sweat. But it didn't help. Each evening he'd sit on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sun disappeared behind the canyons, wondering if Nita was smiling, wondering if her mother ever thought about the stranger who brought her child home. He told himself it was over, that he'd done his part, but the ache in his chest said otherwise. It wasn't love, not yet, but something like destiny pulling its slow thread through the quiet of his days. Then one evening, as dusk bled into the sky, the sound of hooves broke through the stillness. Luke stood, hand instinctively near his holster. A single rider approached from the ridge, horse staggering with exhaustion. When the figure came into the light, Luke froze. It was Ayana, Nita's mother. Her hair was loose, dust covering her face, and her eyes were wild with fear. Without a word, she slid off the horse, nearly collapsing. Luke caught her by the arm. "What happened?" he asked. She struggled for breath, speaking a mix of Apache and broken English. From the few words he could grasp, Luke understood enough. Raiders had attacked their camp. The same men who'd been hunting Apache families for bounty, cruel and ruthless. Ayana had escaped with Nita and a few others, but the rest were dead or scattered. Luke didn't ask another question. He helped her inside, poured her water, and without waiting for the night to settle, began loading his rifle. By the time the stars came out, shadows were moving across the land. Luke could feel it. They were being hunted. He looked at Ayana and Nita huddled near the fire, fear written on their faces, and something inside him hardened. Not again, he thought. Not this time. He handed Ayana a small pistol, motioning for her to stay behind him. She didn't argue. Instead, she checked the chamber with steady hands, a quiet strength in her, movements that reminded him of every story he'd ever heard about. Apache warriors, proud, unbreakable, fierce when protecting their own. The first gunshot split the night like thunder. Luke fired back, the flash lighting up the dark. Men shouted from the shadows, trying to circle the ranch. He moved fast, taking cover behind the trough, returning shot after shot. Ayana joined him, firing with precision, her eyes cold and sharp. The air was thick with gunpowder and dust, and Nita screamed from inside, calling out for her mother. It only made Ayana fight harder. When one raider tried to rush the porch, she hit him square in the chest without hesitation. The rest began to fall back, but Luke wasn't done. He fired until the last of them disappeared into the dark hills. When the silence finally returned, the night was thick with smoke and fear. Luke leaned against the porch rail, breathing hard, his shoulder bleeding from a graze. Ayana rushed to him, tearing a strip from her dress and pressing it against the wound. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and the only sound was Nita sobbing softly inside. Luke looked at her mother, her face illuminated by the faint orange glow. In her eyes there was no longer just gratitude, There was recognition. Two broken souls from two worlds who had both lost everything and somehow found each other standing in the same fight. Over the next few days, the ranch turned into a refuge. Ayana and a few of her people stayed, helping repair what the raiders had destroyed. She moved quietly, always working, but every glance she shared with Luke carried something unspoken, an understanding that went deeper than words. He taught her some English. She taught him a few Apache words in return. They spoke mostly through gestures, small smiles, and long silences that said more than speech ever could. Nita began to laugh again, running through the fields, chasing the ranch dog, her voice echoing across the plains like sunlight, breaking through clouds. Luke found himself smiling too, something he hadn't done freely in years. At night, when the stars blanketed the sky, Ayana would sit by the fire and hum an old Apache song. Luke would sit nearby, pretending to clean his rifle, but really just listening. Her voice was low and steady, full of sorrow and beauty, carrying memories of a world he would never know but could somehow feel. He thought of his late wife sometimes, but the pain didn't sting like it used to. Life, he realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to live again after loss. And somehow Ayana and Nita had given him that gift without even trying. One morning as the sun rose over the valley, Ayana came to him by the corral. The others were ready to leave, to rejoin their people in a new settlement deeper in Apache land. Nita clung to her mother's skirt, looking at Luke with wide eyes. Ayana hesitated, then stepped closer. "You saved us," she said softly, her English careful but clear. Luke tipped his hat, not trusting his voice. "You saved me first," he finally replied. There was a long pause. Then Ayana reached out and placed her hand over his, a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they couldn't say. She left that afternoon, riding away with her people, Nita waving until they disappeared behind the ridges. Luke stood watching long after they were gone, his heart both full and empty. Months passed and the world kept turning. Peace slowly settled between settlers and the Apache. Though scars remained on both sides, Luke went on with his life, fixing fences, riding the range, working the land. But every now and then he'd find himself looking toward the horizon, half expecting to see that familiar figure riding back through the dust. Then one spring morning, as the river swelled with melted snow, he saw movement in the distance. Two riders approached slowly, and a woman and a child, Ayana and Nita. The same wind that once carried her away now brought her back. Luke stepped forward, his chest tight, every heartbeat echoing louder than the last. Ayana dismounted, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time she smiled, not as a stranger, not as someone who owed a debt, but as a woman who had found where she belonged. Luke took off his hat, the breeze lifting through the valley, and Nita ran into his arms, laughing. The cowboy who once thought his life was over had found not only a family but a reason to live again.